Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 175, Shakespeare on the Radio, a conversation with Andrea Smith. On today's guest episode, we welcome Andrea Smith to the podcast. Andrea's book, Shakespeare on the Radio, has just been published, and she kindly agreed to come on and give us some highlights from her very detailed review of Shakespeare on BBC Radio in the last 100 years. Andrea Smith is a lecturer at the University of Suffolk, specialising in Shakespeare and audio drama. Her research looks at how stage plays can be turned into something purely aural, through voice, music, sound effects and other non-verbal noises. As I was listening back to our conversation, I realised that there are a few things we mentioned that come as second nature to us Brits, but might be a little obscure for anybody outside of the islands of the United Kingdom. I'm sure you all know something of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, and the central role it came to play in British life as it developed through the 20th century. But maybe not that its first Director-General was John Reith. His views and personality played a huge part in the formation of the early BBC, and you will hear Andrea give him a name check shortly. And for a bit of background on some of the BBC terminology we use, radio was divided into three services. Broadly speaking, the home service broadcast news, talks and drama. The light programme was for music, comedy and variety shows. And the third programme featured classical music, drama and discussions orientated around the arts and culture. In 1967, the stations were reorganised into radios 1, 2, 3 and 4, with radios 3 and 4 including audio dramas. These stations still exist today and are supplemented by new digital stations like Radio 4 Extra, which broadcasts archive BBC material. To start with, we went right back to even before the beginnings of the BBC and 1923. As you point out in the introduction to your book, Shakespeare is inextricably linked to the birth of broadcasting in the UK. The first time his words were spoken on air predates the BBC, as actor Robert Atkins gave a dramatic recital of Act 1, Scene 3 of The Merchant of Venice on an experimental London station on 2nd of September 1922. So, and I know this is a bit of a difficult question, can you give us a quick sketch of how that relationship continued once the BBC got established?
Yeah, so the BBC is properly established November 22. And really in those very early days, they're trying to work out what radio is and what to do with it and what to put on it. And fairly quickly, they're kind of thinking drama in some way, shape or form. So what starts early in 23, February 23, we start to get scenes from Shakespeare. So you get famous actors performing bits of Shakespeare. And then Shakespeare's birthday has always been a big time for celebration. The 23rd of April is marked as his birthday. We don't absolutely know. It's the day he died. And he was christened just after, it's something like the 26th, I think he was christened. So prediction is he probably was born around 23rd. So that's always a big celebratory day. 23rd of April, 1923. There's a big show at the Haymarket in London with lots of famous actors doing bits of Shakespeare. After they did the Haymarket, they came into the BBC and did a whole load of scenes. That seems to have been what then led to the first play a month later, because a lot of those actors who were in that original bits and pieces of scenes in the April turn up in the first play in May 23, which was Twelfth Night. And from then on, you really don't ever stop getting Shakespeare on BBC Radio. And it's, on average, it's about 2 or 3 a year, new productions. I think the year of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, there were 11. So some years you couldn't move for it. So, but it has been, and then that's on top of, documentaries and discussions and plays about Shakespeare and all the rest of it. He is so embedded in the history of the BBC. It's quite amazing, really.
Okay, so before we get into that history a bit more, can you just give us a word about how do you research this stuff? Archives, recordings still exist?
Yes, for quite a lot. So it's in various places. So the very early stuff not recorded, predates recording. The 20s is just too early. The BBC starts to record bits and pieces, but not whole productions in the 30s. And we start to get whole productions from the 40s, but they are not publicly available. So I had to get permission from the BBC, and they had to give me access to get some of those very early ones. They were still on very quite primitive forms of recording. They had to digitize them for me so that I could then listen to them. So the very early stuff is much harder to access. But by the time you get to the kind of 50s and 60s, a good chunk is being archived, and from roughly 1970 onwards, I think there's one missing from 1970. The BBC have the whole archive, and then a lot of that is available. There's an academic website called Box of Broadcasts. It's run by Learning on Screen. Most universities in the UK have access, some other academic institutions as well, and pretty much everything from certainly the mid-70s onwards is there. So I did a playlist for Box of Broadcasts, which has something like, it's over 100 productions on it, because the BBC has given them access to digital copies, and they've got them all. So now if you go to Box of Broadcasts and you look for Shakespeare on radio, you can go, oh, well, there's like half a dozen Macbeths, and there's 3 Titus Andronicus, or whatever it is. There's, every play has been done. Even things like the poems, Venus and Adonis, has been done 3 times, and you can access. So if you want to look at how that's been done on the radio, so it's amazing what is available. There are other places that are perhaps, certainly there are places you can definitely get it officially, and there's stuff you can get unofficially. So Audible has quite a lot of BBC productions, but of course you have to pay for that. It's a subscription service. Internet Archive sometimes has stuff. I'm not quite sure how legitimately the stuff is on Internet Archive. So I'm not publicising or suggesting that you should look there, but you might find stuff is there. And there are other websites, particularly for very old stuff. There are kinds of various old time websites and things, and sometimes BBC stuff turns up on that. Often it's American, but you do sometimes get BBC stuff there. So finding the audio archive is, the BBC does still hold a lot, but getting access to that within the BBC can be a bit tricky. There is an amazing amount that's either in the public domain or accessible to academics. So, and I did all my research remotely. I did it all from home. I didn't have to travel anywhere to go and sit in a little booth and listen to stuff, with the exception of one play held by the British Library that the BBC didn't have. And the British Library does still make you go and sit in a booth to listen to it. And rather brilliantly, about a couple of years later, the Radio Circle, which is an organisation that looks for missing productions of all sorts of things, radio, TV, everything. They look for all this stuff that's missing from the archive. They found a copy of the play. And so I was very privileged to be involved in the restoration of that and getting that back on air. And I did the introduction for it when it's broadcast again on Radio 3. So that kind of felt like I come full circle with that production.
Yes.
But yeah, it's all over the place. Some of it is easier to find than others, but it's amazing what has been digitised now. The stuff that isn't available as audio, there is an extraordinary amount of written information out there. So, for example, the BBC's magazine, Radio Times, which now obviously if you buy it, you'll see it covers radio and TV and across streaming platforms and everything, but originally was started as basically a way of finding out what's on BBC Radio, because that was all that existed at the time. And that started about a year after the BBC did. Amazing, not just listings, but a huge number of articles, letters from listeners, and all that is digitally available. You can get all the listings throughout its history. For things, there's a kind of cut-off where you can't get whole copies of the paper, but again, British Library have got those. So, but that can be really useful. There was another magazine called The Listener, long defunct now, gone about 35 years now. But again, articles, reviews, all sorts of stuff that tells you how this stuff was done and what it sounded like. And then again, newspapers, radio it's a bit like when the internet came along or when social media came along, suddenly everyone goes, oh, this is an amazing thing. There's this thing called radio, and everybody's excited about it. Newspapers are excited about it. Or, when cinema first happened, any of these big media innovations that have happened, lots and lots of stuff in newspapers. So again, reviews, letters, previews, interviews with the stars, so much written stuff that it's amazing how good a picture you can put together of what these things sounded like.
So even before you started writing, you had lots of listening and lots of reaction and previewing and reviewing that you could review yourself.
I did. And I was actually working on most of this during COVID. So I used to go for my daily walk listening to a Shakespeare play. So I was still doing my research while I was doing my daily walk. But yeah, I listened to, it was over 150 plays. And then goodness knows how many things I've read. I couldn't tell you. So yeah.
And many of the plays multiple times, evidently. So you get a sense of how they change in production through the years.
Absolutely. So things like Macbeth has been done a huge number of times, and a lot of those are in the archive. And that's really interesting, hearing how different people tackle, say, something like the witches. Most people are aware of the witches in Macbeth, even if you don't know Macbeth well, you know there are witches in there. And sometimes it's kind of laden with sound effects and music, and it's being really, really spooky. One of my favourite productions has no sound. It's just the witches' voices, nothing. And I love it because it is so against what everyone expects the witches to be. It's kind of, we're not putting all the thunder and lightning sounds and kind of, spooky music and cauldron bubbling. We're actually doing it completely quiet. And that actually is much more eerie and sinister. So, yeah, you can hear different productions do things differently. And, yeah, it's fascinating the impact that can have on the plays as well.
Yeah. So just to go back to those very early days, I think we can all imagine quite easily that Shakespeare is a playwright of words and descriptions and the imagination. So that translates to an audio medium quite well. So did those early producers have any difficulties in translating the plays into the new medium?
It sort of sometimes varies from play to play, because you're quite right. A lot of people in the very early days went, well, Shakespeare's perfect for radio, because a lot of the time he tells us what we're seeing, because he does. He will describe things. There's a play, Richard II, and there's a bit where Richard himself is on a battlement, and the characters who are on the ground looking up at him describe him. So you've got that moment where you don't need to have any extra information because the characters are telling it to you. So there's quite a lot of that in Shakespeare, partly because his stage was very bare. You would have had virtually no set, very few props. There'd have been costume, but there would have been not a lot else. So therefore, sometimes it is in the words because it has to be, because otherwise audience. Again, sometimes there's stuff in the words that indicate whether it's night or day, because his theatre was performed in daylight. You couldn't use lighting effects. So therefore, it had to be in the words. So that's really helpful. There are the odd things that aren't. And the thing I always pick up is Hamlet, because at the end of Hamlet, there's a big sword fight. Hamlet and Laertes fight each other. And Laertes has poisoned the end of his sword. And the significant thing that happens is they drop their swords and they end up swapping them. That is not in the text. Laertes and Hamlet do not tell you they've done that.
Right.
So you need to do something so the listening audience know that has happened. And if you go back into some of the early productions, they'll add narration. There's some of the early productions use sometimes a lot of narration, sometimes not so much, but often they use narration. So you'll suddenly get this narrator's voice coming in. They've been fighting and they've dropped their swords, they've swapped swords, and to explain what's going on, so that you understand. Oh no, Hamlet's got the poison sword now. But there's a production that was done in the 70s with Ronald Pickup as Hamlet, and in that one, the producer editor added just, I think, 5 words or something. And he says something like, Laertes says, "My sword." And Hamlet goes, "My sword now." And you go, oh, right, that's all you need. Yeah. They've swapped swords. That's it. You've done it. So they've done it in the dialogue. So I think producers do get smarter and a little bit kind of feel more able to make tweaks to the text. I think very early doors, they don't feel that they're allowed to change Shakespeare. He's far too precious to edit him or change him. There was a lot of discussion in the early days. A lot of the newspapers and magazines and that were fixated on this idea that, how dare you edit Shakespeare? Well, because his plays are really long. John Gielgud did Hamlet, and it ran for it was virtually 4 hours because it had 2 intervals in it.
Wow.
It was enormous. Boxing night, 1948, whole night. So you have to ask, do people really want 4 hours? I mean, I love Shakespeare. But that's a lot of listening in one go. So yeah, I think people felt more able later on to make changes. I mean, it's interesting that very first production in 1923, Twelfth Night. That's the play that begins, "If music be the food of love, play on." That's the quote people must be aware of, which is Orsino who's moping about because he's in love with a woman who's not in love with him.
Yeah.
That's how the play opens. The second scene is a shipwreck. Viola is shipwrecked and she arrives on this island and thinks her brother has died and is trying to work out what to do and decides to disguise herself as a boy. Typical Shakespearean trope, girl described as boy. Anyway, when that came to that 1923 production, the person who did the edit, who prepared it for radio, was an actress called Kathleen Nesbitt. And she wanted to swap those scenes around, which for radio makes perfect sense, because what you do is you start with sound effects and a storm, and then you've got the big dramatic opening to hook people in and keep them listening. Her co-producer on this was a member of BBC staff, Cecil Lewis, who decided that they were going to ask George Bernard Shaw to give an introduction to it. George Bernard Shaw got to see the script and basically tore it apart because he said, "How dare you do that to Shakespeare? He knows how to do a play." What? Bear in mind, George Bernard Shaw was also highly critical of Shakespeare himself. But so they didn't, as far as I know, they didn't swap the first two scenes. They put them back the normal way around. So there's right from the beginning, people are thinking in terms of sound and they're thinking about how this will work for radio. They're a little bit squashed at times, but there's definitely that ideal to try and make it work in a sound medium, recognizing that it's not on stage.
Right. And well, I think you've really anticipated my next question there, because there's this idea that the early BBC was a very stuffy and formal organisation, although a lot of that has to do with the mores of the time, I think, rather than they were very different.
Yeah.
But it very quickly became an establishment organisation. But there are some very individual characters working within the BBC. I think you mentioned Cecil Lewis there, and there were others who were both managers behind the scenes and actually doing some of the broadcasting as well. So does their influence feed into the way that Shakespeare was presented?
I think it's really interesting. We BBC now is just this enormous media organisation known around the world, and you forget that it started as this little scrappy organisation that was kind of just trying to find out what radio is. We don't really know. We'll try a bit of this, we'll try a bit of that. But you know, that it's really interesting. And there were some big personalities. I think there's a real swing between I'm not saying Reith was perfect, but there's some things about Reith that I really like. He seems to have really encouraged innovation. He seems to be very supportive of his female members of staff wanting to progress, which definitely post-Second World War, I mean, women disappear from radio drama in terms of producers after the Second World War. They just seem to vanish. But prior to the Second World War, there's a lot of women involved in producing these plays and bringing their own ideas to it. There's sometimes clearly a bit of a tussle. There was a producer called Barbara Burnham. I would love to have met this woman. She sounds like quite a tough cookie. She did a couple of productions of Hamlet. And the first one, she got a lot of criticism because it was so heavily cut, to the point that she actually wrote back to, I think it was the Radio Times, it may have been the Listener, one of those, saying, "It's not my fault. I wasn't given enough time," basically. So the next time she comes to do it, and I don't think this is a coincidence, the play is overrunning, like massively overrunning. By probably an hour, it's overrunning. There's some debate about who decided to cut it off, but somebody decided to cut it off. And so you got an continuity announcer going, "And there we must leave them." And everybody's still alive. We haven't killed anybody. I think perhaps Polonius is dead, but the majority of them are all still alive at this point. And I think that's her going, "Okay, people don't want it cut. I'm not cutting it." I genuinely think she just went, "All right, then make me finish this play." And you just think that's because it was so far, and she was very experienced. She'd have known it was overrunning. She'd have known that it was well over. It wasn't like it was overrunning by 10 minutes. It was overrunning by, definitely more than 100.
No, they must have known. They must have known that in rehearsal and whatever.
Exactly. They would have known. They'd have known. So I think she was chancing her arm to see if she could just push the next programmes off air and keep going. And then there was some sort of kerfuffle, and it's various different people have different stories about what happened, about whose decision it was, whoever's decision it was taken off air. And I think she went, well, if I'm not allowed enough time, I'm just going to make enough time. I just think, how brilliant. So there were definitely big personalities around and sort of able to get away with it. I'm not sure if you did that now, you'd keep your job, you know.
Quite, I'm sure you wouldn't. I'm sure you
but yeah, no, she was still around for quite a while afterwards. So yeah, that there's interesting stuff went on in those days.
And there's a big break, isn't there, with the Second World War, because the BBC gets effectively, well, it gets taken off air and then functions as a mouthpiece for the government through the war in various ways. So 2 questions really. How do things change after the war? And is that the point at which we start to get pre-recorded performances rather than live?
Yeah, they don't happen until after the war. War was a very scrappy time for radio drama generally. Shakespeare is one of the things they held on to. I think, again, that kind of wrapped up in national identity was a big thing. So people who are aware of films of Shakespeare are probably aware that Laurence Olivier did a film of Henry V in 1944. Big kind of propaganda, essentially, film. People are much less aware that radio did it twice before, in 42 and 43, both of which were also propaganda productions, one of which starred an actor called Esmond Knight, who I believe is the grandfather of the theatre director Marianne Elliott. Oh, right. And he was blind. He'd been blinded in action. And it was a big thing that he was playing Hamlet. You know, one of our war heroes not Hamlet, sorry, Henry V. Right. One of our war heroes is coming to play Henry V on the radio. And it was a massive propaganda thing. What's interesting about radio is that, so at the start of the war, radio is still going, but in a very minor way. Stuff has moved out of London. Radio drama goes from 2-hour productions of Shakespeare to half-hour because they kind of, people went, the people at the BBC, people in the government went, nobody wants drama. And of course, all the theatres shut and everyone went, we need drama. Where's our drama? Theatres will shut. So suddenly radio drama is back as being important. We start off with a lot of the history plays, which are largely centred around battles and war. And as the war goes on, the audience are basically going, we've had enough war. We want an escape from war. And so what happens is that radio provides the tragedies and the comedies. So you get people like, there was a comedy double act in this period called Elsie and Doris Waters, who are probably forgotten by most people now, but very famous at the time, hugely famous. And they did Merry Wives of Windsor, one of Shakespeare's comedies, and they played the 2 wives of the title. And this is clearly, people need lifting up. They need something to feel happy about. The first full production we have is from 1944, and it's As You Like It, another comedy. And again, it feels like it's that we want something about pastoral England. We want something to celebrate who we are and a reason to fight and a reason to be proud of our nation at a time when everything feels horrible. That's what's going on. And then after the war, it then becomes more celebratory, and we get they do a big cycle of all the history plays, and I think it's something like 47, so a couple of years after. And now we are celebrating our history again because the war's over and we can cope with it now. And you're right, that's when we start to get recorded productions. And quite often it's detailed in the Radio Times whether it's a recorded production or not, because obviously it was kind of a new thing to be recorded. Stuff pre-war is pretty much entirely live. If you've got a recording of it, it's because somebody chose to record a section of it. The expression you get used is to bottle it. They wanted to bottle bits of these plays to keep hold of as a sort of like as a memory. So, for example, we've got a 10-minute section of Hamlet from 1938 with Leslie Howard, who is brilliant, and died in the war. And you just think, oh my goodness, if he'd been able to go on and do more, if we got more recordings of him, it'd be so brilliant. He's superb. But yeah, so that does change. And initially recording is just like live. Wow. They don't have the facility to edit. So recording doesn't make it any better in the sense. So the production I mentioned of John Gilder, the 4-hour Hamlet, that is a recording. They weren't doing that live on Boxing Night. But there's no editing. So there's things like, there's a little ad lib from one of the actors, and you could hear Gielgud go, trying not to laugh. So, because you can't edit this stuff, it's just got to go as it is. So, yeah, but once you start to get towards, particularly once you get to to me, this feels like a modern technology. And then to some of your listeners, they'll go, what on earth's that? 1/4-inch tape. So, if you're a younger listener, if you've seen old-fashioned sci-fi programs with big reels of tape, yeah, that's what we used to record our audio on. And I worked in radio for a long while, and that's what I worked on initially.
I did smile to myself when I was looking through your book, and you have a glossary at the front with some of these terms, but quite rightly you put them there because maybe younger people wouldn't understand them. But yes, I recognise many of them from my days of doing a bit of tape editing in the sound box at the theatre.
So, but the advantage of 1/4-inch tape is because you can edit it, you can cut it. So you took a razor blade to it, and you cut a bit out, and you stuck it back together with a bit of tape. But that was a major step forward. And again, once you've got the ability to record and then dub, so you can then record onto another tape. So you've got your master tape with your recording on it, but you can then mix in sound effects. They don't have to be done live. So early sound effects are all done live alongside the recording. So even the recorded productions, the sound effects would have been done live with them because everything would have been recorded in one go.
Yeah.
And once you start getting a little further down the line, you can then start mixing stuff. And funny enough, some of the productions we've got from the 50s, we don't have the play, but we still have the audio, we still have the music, because the music was kept, even if the play wasn't, slightly strangely. So we have a couple of reels of tape of, I think it's tape, of productions of The Tempest in the 1950s. Rather strangely, they did 2 productions within 4 months of each other, one on Radio 3 and one on Radio 4, or what were the forerunners to Radio 3 and 4. And the lovely thing about that is the music is so very different. One production of The Tempest has this very modern, very Radio 3-ish, modern classical music, stark, kind of quite scary music. And the other one has proper old-fashioned, what you might imagine Shakespeare music to be, a little bit twee, very pastoral. And you go, oh, right, we can see where that production's going. Literally, by the difference in the music, you can tell where these things are heading. Completely different sound, even though they're the same play.
Mm. And I suppose we shouldn't forget that in those earlier days, the actors themselves had to learn microphone technique and studio behaviour and all of that kind of stuff, because this was all new to them as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. At that kind of, because they would do it all around one microphone. So you might have quite a large cast. So you've got to step in and out so that you're not in each other's way. You also might use that stepping in and out to signal things. So things like you might approach the microphone saying your line, so your voice gets louder, so there's a sense of you approaching, you're entering a space. So there's lots of stuff around that. There's an actor called Stephen Murray, who's probably best known now for the Navy Lark, the sitcom. It gets repeated kind of endlessly on Radio 4 Extra. And Stephen Murray was a great Shakespearean actor. He's kind of very sort of almost forgotten and very underrated, but he was extremely good, did a lot of radio. But he also did some telly, and he did one very unusual thing, which was he did a radio production of Macbeth and a TV production of Macbeth, completely different productions. He was the only person who was common to both within a month of each other. And he wrote an article for the Radio Times talking about the difference in mic technique, because in radio, you, to a certain extent, control your microphone technique. So you can move in and out of the microphone. So if you want to sort of shout, you can move away and you can shout, or you can whisper really quietly into the microphone. And you can use it. You, as an actor, have control over all of that and how important it is. And of course, in TV, you just have a big boom mic over the top. And you just have to be loud enough for that to, someone else is all controlling it. And you can't use any dynamics, because it's got to be a constant level, because otherwise the mic, this is the 40s. The mic's not going to pick you up otherwise. So, talking about the fact that you get a sort of a bit more creative control over your own voice in radio in a way that you didn't in TV in those early days.
It's fascinating to think what a learning curve that must have been for people in the day. So moving forward a bit, let's go forward to, say, the 1960s, where we're getting a lot of innovation on the stage in Shakespeare, Peter Brook, etc. So does the same happen in radio? Is there more experimentation going on?
It's really interesting, because there are some people who are, and some people are very resistant. And then even those who feel like the resistant sort of are, but in a very covert way. So I'll explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
There's a producer called Raymond Rakes. Now, I never met Raymond, sadly. I would wish I had. He sounds like an absolute scream. He would always refer to it as the show. It wasn't the production or the play, it was the show. He was absolutely about. He started as an actor, and it was about radio was show business as far as he was concerned. So every production he does, he's trying to make show business. He was one of the pioneers of using stereo. So he really wanted people to be able to use stereo sound to picture where people were standing, so that you got an actual physical image in your head of what's going on. He used the radiophonic workshop. So these are the people best known for doing the soundtrack for Doctor Who, the theme tune for Doctor Who, but they did lots of incredibly bizarre sounds and things. They worked on The Goon Show, which is an early comedy show which had a lot of sound effects in it. They created all kinds of things. So he worked with them on stuff. He did Midsummer Night's Dream, and he used them to help the sounds of the fairies to make them sound more magical. But he was also quite old school. So in 1970, he deliberately does Midsummer Night's Dream as a spoiler to Peter Brook. Okay. It's been announced that Peter Brook is going to do Midsummer Night's Dream at the RSC. This is the production that goes on to become famous for being the white box. So this is a completely white box set, and everyone's in bright jewel colours, and there's trapezes, and it's extraordinary production. And he's absolutely not buying into this at all. And he's going, oh, this is going to be terrible. He wrote something for the Radio Times that basically said, it's going to be terrible. Listen to ours will be so much better. Essentially is what he's saying. And yet he's doing stereo, which is brand new. He's using the radiophonic workshop, which is unusual. He may be using some traditional music, but he's also using these innovative techniques as well. So even somebody like him, who on the face of it is a kind of almost an old fuddy-duddy, isn't really. He wants to project that because I think he thinks that's what the audience want. But actually he himself is obviously much more interested in what radio can do and the different things it can do. So he is keen to stretch that a bit and do something different with it. So it's, there is. And of course, in terms of radio, the other thing that's happening in the 60s is you're getting people come through like Harold Pinter, Joe Orton, Beckett is working for radio in the 50s, 60s. You've got some really interesting modern playwrights coming along as well at the same time. But still Shakespeare is there. Shakespeare is still king. And so it's an interesting period because some stuff in drama is really starting to change and some stuff is staying very similar. And there isn't really a major shift, I would say, until you get to the current century, into the 21st century, which is extraordinarily late because theatre moves quite a lot in terms of Shakespeare production, particularly towards the end of the 20th century. You get more diversity in casting. Still had a long way to go, but you're starting to get that. You're starting to get more women cast in traditionally male roles. Things like that are starting to happen, and that doesn't really happen in radio until much later, despite the fact that you can't see anybody in radio. So what does it matter who somebody is? Right in the very early days, there's a radio producer called Felix Felton who said something like, you can cast a fat man as a thin man, you can cast a tall man as a short man. Nobody would be any the wiser. But radio really doesn't use it to its advantage until considerably later in its history. It's kind of strange.
Yes, it is a bit, because you think the actors themselves who maybe weren't physically suitable for a role might think, radio's my thing, to go and play those big parts that I'm not going to get the opportunity to do on stage.
Yeah, I think you're right. And but also then there are people who dominate radio. So in terms of Shakespearean performance, Gielgud is the person who kind of dominates. It's, I'm sure, not a coincidence that his brother was head of radio drama for over 30 years. So,
he did have a good voice as well.
He did. Say. And actually, to be fair, I really love listening to Gielgud. I do. But Olivier did very little radio, who is kind of broadly contemporary with often phrased in the same.
Yes.
And then people but Edith Evans, who was a great stage performer, Peggy Ashcroft, another big stage performer, they both did a lot of radio Shakespeare. And then people like Paul Schofield. So these are all kind of mid-20th century people. A lot of these people who were very well known at the RSC, or actually before it was called the RSC, it was the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. A lot of people from there did a lot of radio as well, and perhaps edged out a lot of other people who might have done things. So, for example, Gielgud's Hamlet was so successful, it got repeated something like 8 times. That's unheard of. There's no other production on that. And I suspect that's why there aren't that many other Hamlets for a very long while. Because, well, we'll just get Gielgud out again.
Yeah, just didn't need to do it again. Yeah.
No, and so, yeah, there are definitely actors who probably didn't get their chance because people like, and Michael Redgrave is the other one who did a lot. And so, again, Michael Redgrave does Hamlet when he's something like 52. So there's someone who's trying to say, to be fair, he sounds like he's trying to sound young. I don't think it's a particularly convincing production. But again, that's the interesting thing, that some actors are allowed to go, well, I'm way too old, but I can still play the part. And some actors aren't. And it's because one of the things about particularly the BBC in that mid-20th century period is it just seems to be, well, somebody described it to me as like a fiefdom. It's like, you know, there's nobody kind of looking over their shoulders and going, I don't think you should do that, or haven't you used them a lot? It's like, do you want to do this play? Yeah, I want to do this play. And off they go. And it seems to be very much that it's down to individual producers what they do. And therefore, if they like a particular actor, they just come back again and again. And perhaps other people aren't getting the chances they could and should have had.
Yeah. So in that 100 years you've studied, the landscape has changed so much. I mean, the people who started back in 1922 could not imagine what we do now with radio and digital and all of that. Is it possible to sum up the impact that radio productions of Shakespeare have had over that period?
I think one thing that it did, particularly mid-20th century, is that it made Shakespeare accessible to millions of people, and I mean tens of millions of people, in a way that would not have been, in particular Shakespeare's less well-known plays. So your local theatre might possibly do Macbeth, it might do Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah,
it's not going to do Titus Andronicus.
No,
it's it's not going to do the less well-known plays. And suddenly all these plays, and for that matter a lot of other stuff, you know, a lot of Greek drama, a lot of Shakespeare's contemporaries, all this theatre that really wasn't being staged anywhere except perhaps occasionally in London, and getting to London would have been incredibly difficult for most people at that time, is suddenly everywhere. And there's a lot of playwrights who come through post-war who say, one of the things, and actors too, one of the things that got me into this was listening to the radio. Ronald Pickup, who I mentioned, who played Hamlet, when he played Hamlet, he gave an interview where he said, one of the reasons I'm an actor is because I listen to radio drama.
Yeah.
That's how I ended up doing this, is because I listened. So it was hugely influential, and it made these plays much more accessible to people, even though in those days you'd have had to sit down and listen to it at the time of broadcast. And if you missed it, you missed it. But even so, that was possible. When TV comes along, that does rather knock radio out a little bit.
Yeah.
Suddenly nobody's really interested in radio anymore. What does happen is that it goes under the radar a bit. So you start to get perhaps slightly more, you know, you get more of the unusual plays, you get producers doing what they want to do rather than feeling that they're so much pandering to an audience, particularly when you get sort of the 70s thereabouts. So that kind of has an impact. I think it's interesting now because suddenly audio is king again. You know, there's a radio producer called Dirk Maggs, not done Shakespeare, but done lots of stuff, did the continuations of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and has done lots of comedy and all sorts of things. He currently does the Sandman adaptations for Audible. And he said that really at the turn of the millennium, he thought radio drama might be dead. And that was his work. That was, you know, and he was worried that it was going to die. Now we all have our phones with, you know, things like BBC Sounds or Audible or whatever the app is in our pocket, and our tiny little headphones, and we take it everywhere. And suddenly people are listening to podcasts, but they're also listening to audio drama again. People are now reaching back for drama. And it's kind of interesting that Shakespeare is still a big part of that. And I think there is, with my own students, they are asking me about audio as well. How can I listen to something that will help my studies? They don't necessarily want to sit and watch something or watch something on their phones. You know, so many of us are traveling to work, traveling to education, looking after family, whatever it happens to be, audio is really easy because you can do that and do something else at the same time. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that Radio Shakespeare will continue. And there will be a new production of King Lear this year on BBC. So there is that tradition of there still being new productions is still happening. And yeah, I think there was a point at which it felt like radio drama might die. But the fact that now, that thanks to the fact you can download it, it's often available for a month. Some of them are available for over a year. You don't have to be like you were in the 50s, all sitting around the tiny little crackly radio to hear that production. You don't have to listen to it in one go. You can listen to half an hour and then come back for the rest another time. That, I think, is making a big difference to people.
Yeah, I know there's quite a lot of concern at the minute about how much is going to still be on the BBC.
Drama is a particular concern. So, yeah, because the BBC has axed Drama on 3, which was the Radio 3 drama slot. Now, that has been the home of Shakespeare for 80 years, and that has gone. The King Lear I mentioned, that's going to be on Radio 4. Radio 4 doesn't really have extended slots, so it's going to be interesting to see. They have done a couple of productions in recent years, which have been in 2 parts. So I suspect we might see a bit more of that. And I wonder if we might see a bit more of those archive productions brought out and put onto 4 Extra, which is their archive station. But it's interesting. At the moment, Audible haven't got into doing Shakespeare. I keep begging people at Audible to go, please do some. I think because Audible is looking for series. That's what they want. They want drama series, because then people don't just buy into one, they buy into a series. But I don't think Shakespeare will go away. And the other thing that happened during the pandemic, is that suddenly both professional and amateurs realised audio drama is something I can do with actually not a great deal of expense, not a great deal of kit, and still make it sound reasonably good. At times, very good. There's a theatre in America. They do Theatre in the Park in New York every year, public theatre in New York. They did 2 productions during the lockdowns that they did entirely via Zoom, but worked really hard with audio engineers to make sure the sound quality was there and how they'd put it all together. And I think we might start to see there are a number of really quite ropey amateur productions out there, to be honest. But I think it's, things like drama courses at universities and drama schools, those sort of things. I think it is now becoming a possibility to do this without massive expense and still make a product that sounds very good, and then becomes a calling card as well, that you can produce something that then, what have you done? Well, have a listen to my production of Romeo and Juliet, or whatever it happens to be. So I try to be hopeful about these things. I would love it if the BBC had left a little bit of a door open for some longer length, not just for Shakespeare actually, but for other radio drama. I think it's a great shame to lose those really long production, well, not really long, hour and a half is not really long, but lose those longer length productions that we have now potentially lost forever, because Radio 3 is gone and Radio 4 doesn't have a slot that size. It has to create one if it wants to play that length. But yeah, I think there are other organisations now out there that weren't even sort of, 5 years ago, that were kind of, now people are going, oh, maybe this is something we can do. So I think it will just, as ever, it'll evolve, it will change and it'll evolve, and it just might not be focused on the BBC anymore, but there will be other people producing audio drama. And it's kind of weird now, because I never know whether to call stuff radio drama or audio drama anymore, because, I rarely listen to radio drama on the radio. I do sometimes, but quite often, because for me, it's not always on at the time that it's convenient. So there's a play on this afternoon that I want to listen to. Is it 2:15? I'm working. So I shall download it from BBC Sounds and listen to it later. Is that audio drama or is that radio drama? But it's produced by a radio station, but I listen to it like it's a podcast. So I don't know.
Just to finish up, and we'll try and retain the optimistic note, we've mentioned lots of different resources through the course of our conversation, so perhaps we could just run through those again, so if anyone wants to pick any of that up. First and foremost, obviously, there's BBC Sounds, which I think is more accessible than BBC Television is outside of the UK, so might be more that people can find there. But you also mentioned learning on screen.
Yes. So Learning on Screen is a website which is linked to universities nationwide. They have a sort of sub-website called Boxer Broadcasts. If you're in education, if you're a lecturer and you haven't sussed out this site, please do. It is brilliant. The amount of stuff on their TV and radio is extraordinary. But there is a playlist. If you search for my name, Radio Shakespeare, it should come up, of all, let's say, it's over 100 productions, and there's multiple productions. I think there's very few plays where there's just the one. So again, if you're looking either for pleasure to listen, but also if you're looking either because you're studying it and you want something to help you with that study and help, guide you through the play, or you're a lecturer looking to assign something for your students to listen to, there's usually a choice. So you can have a sample of different things and go, oh, yeah, that one I don't like, that one's better, I'll give them that one. Just in the same way as I will also assign TV and film productions and Boxer Broadcasts to my students. So, I will say, go and watch the Hollow Crown version of Richard II, or go and watch BBC TV Shakespeare version of something, or whatever. They're all on there. Yeah. So that's a good source. BBC Sounds, worth knowing with BBC Sounds, stuff doesn't come up very easily on BBC Sounds. So if you type Shakespeare into BBC Sounds, you might not get the plays.
Sounds odd.
It's extremely frustrating. Yes. If you Google, and I'm sorry to plug Google, but if you Google something like BBC Radio Shakespeare play, you're more likely to find the plays. So because the other day I was looking for versions of Twelfth Night, and I knew there were 2 versions on there, and I couldn't find them. And I thought, I know they're there. I've listened. I know that they're on my phone. I know they're there, but I was trying to find links for people, and I couldn't find them. So persevere if you can't find stuff. Most of them will come up under the subsection of Drama on 3 in BBC Sounds. You might have to scoot through a lot of stuff that's not Shakespeare. But if you look at the Drama on 3 stuff, you will find versions of the Henry IV plays, Henry V, Cymbeline, Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, like I say, Twelfth Night, Tempest, all sorts. There's a lot out there. So, you will find it, but it can be a bit of a pain trying to locate.
My thanks to Andrea for taking the time to talk to us. We went rather more up to date there than I usually do on the podcast, but these changes at the BBC seem to be very significant, and I thought it was important for those of us in the UK, and for anyone who cares about the BBC, to hear about what is happening to audio drama. That BBC production of King Lear that Andrea mentioned has now been broadcast and is now available on the BBC Sounds app, and it is rather good. Andrea's book, Shakespeare on the Radio, is published by Edinburgh University Press and is available from wherever you get your books. I've put a couple of links to the online shops in the show notes. Andrea also asked me to point out that for the true radio anoraks, and there's no shame in being one of them, the website for the book has an online appendix listing every BBC Radio Shakespeare production up to 2024. It's a free resource and you don't have to buy the book to access it. I've also put a link to that in the show notes. And I've also added links for the resources Andrea mentioned for the Book of Broadcasts and to the BBC Sounds Drama on 3 page, which is the best place to start your search for audio drama. Andrea has pointed out that at the time of this episode is published, there are versions of Hamlet, Cymbeline, Henry V, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, 2 versions of Antony and Cleopatra and the Tempest, Twelfth Night, Othello, Coriolanus, Measure for Measure, The Merchant of Venice, Richard II, King Lear, The Winter's Tale, Macbeth, As You Like It, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, all available on BBC Sounds, where there is also lots of other audio productions of plays ranging from Shakespeare's contemporaries to the present day. And if you would like to hear more about the history of the BBC generally, and it is a fascinating story, I would thoroughly recommend the podcast The British Broadcasting Century, produced by Paul Carenza. Paul is an entertaining and informative host, giving an independent telling of the history of the BBC, and on at least a couple of occasions you will hear more from Andrea there too. The British Broadcasting Century podcast is available from wherever you get your podcasts. Next time, it's back to Ben Jonson with his successful early play, Every Man in His Humour. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee, or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.